Welcome back to the Dark Mods New Mapper Workshop. This is Springheel, and today we're going to be talking about different kinds of functional props. We've already looked at two different kinds of entities in previous lessons. We've looked at doors last lesson, and we've looked a little bit at keys in that lesson as well. Both of those are examples of entities, and entities are basically things in your map that have function. A model of a chair that just sits there statically is not functional. It doesn't actually do anything. Same with brushwork. Most things in the Dark Mod have particular functions. Doors open and make noise. AI walk around and chase the player. Loot adds to the player's total, etc. So we're going to look at some of the more important entities today that you may want to place in your map. Specifically, we're going to look at these 5 different types of entities: movable objects, player equipment, loot, including chests, readables, which is a big one, and a little bit at levers and switches. So to begin with, we're going to look at movable objects, which, as the name might suggest, are things that the player can fob and hold out in front of them and carry around. You have usually a choice between whether to use a static object like a crate or a movable crate that the player can manipulate. And there's pros and cons to both of those choices. It's really up to the mapper to decide which one suits them best. There is one con, though, that new mappers might not be aware of, and that's I don't know if it's a bug or just a limitation in the Doom 3 physics engine. A moving object like a door or an elevator can push a movable object, but if that movable object hits a second movable object, the impulse is not transferred. So for example, if you have an elevator with 2 movable objects on it, no problem. They can go up the elevator and the elevator will work as normal. But if you put one object on top of the other, like the candle on top of the ragdoll, the elevator pushes the ragdoll, but the ragdoll does not push the candle, and so they're stuck. Take the candle off and set it beside, and there's no problem. So there are definitely pros and cons, but if you decide you do want to include movables in your map, it's pretty easy to do. You right-click and go to Choose Entity, and scroll down till you get to the Movables folder. Make sure it's Movables and not Movers. Those are 2 different things. Under the Movables folder, you'll see a whole bunch of subfolders that are organized like the Models folder. And you just look for whatever kind of object you want to place. You can save a little bit of time with movables by not flooring them. I think we've mentioned this before, that movables fall to the surface under them immediately on map start, so you don't have to worry about putting them right on any surface. You can leave them floating in the air. The next thing we're going to look at is player equipment, and that includes weapons like various arrows, and it also includes things like flash bombs, mines, and potions. So adding player equipment to your map is pretty easy. Again, you just go to Create Entity, and there are 2 folders that apply here. The first is the Player Tools folder, which generally has things that go in inventory, like health potions or mines. Just a note here that you'll, at least in version 2.5, you'll see that there are entries for a slow fall potion and a speed potion. Those don't actually work. If you add them to your map, it will just cause an error. Those potions are not game ready and really should never have made it into the release build. Now there's a little quirk about player tools. For some reason they're set so that they do not fall to the floor on game start. They will fall if they get hit with something, but otherwise they'll stay exactly where you place them. So player tool entities you do have to floor. I should add a note here in case it's not clear. When you're placing player tools, these are for things that the player is going to find in the map. Having the player start with equipment is a totally different method that we'll look at later. The other folder that you will need to use is called Weapons, and it's broken into arrows and melee weapons. This is where you will place things like water arrows or rope arrows that you want the player to find in your map. Unlike player tools, these weapon entities do fall to the floor on game start. Melee weapons like the sword and blackjack don't stack, so their main value would be in missions where you start off with no equipment, like a jailbreak or something. Well, you can't have a mission without loot, so now let's look at how to add loot to your map, and the most common place to find loot, inside chests. So adding loot isn't any more difficult than adding other entities. Again, it's a matter of going to the Choose Entity list, scrolling down till you get to loot, and then you've got two choices. You can use movable loot or you can use static loot. And there's pretty much the same pros and cons there as for any other choice of movable objects. I prefer usually to not use movable objects for really small pieces, like rings or coins that could easily get knocked off a surface, and then once they're knocked off it might be impossible to find them again. It can be useful though for things like vases. If they're movable, you can create interesting puzzles where the player maybe can shoot one off a ledge or something like that. You can get a little bit more information about a loot entity that you've placed by going to the Inherited Properties option. Scroll down till you get to Inv Loot Value, and that will tell you basically how many gold pieces the loot is worth. And that will help maybe guide you if you want, a really expensive loot piece or a very small one. It's also useful for figuring out how much loot the player needs in order to meet their loot goal. That's really all there is to adding loot. And luckily chests are just as easy to add with one or two little pitfalls. You can add most chests that exist by going to the prefabs window, and under containers and then openable you will find a whole series of different pre-made chests. Because we copied my prefabs over top of what was available in 2.5, it looks like there's a couple duplicate folders, but it shouldn't matter which ones you use. Prefab chests are great because everything's already done for you, but there is one small pitfall you've got to be careful of, and that's what's inside the chest. The chests come with a brush inside. If you turn off your clip filter, you'll be able to see it, that red block there. That's something that keeps players from being able to grab objects through the side of the chest, and it's pretty important to make the chest work properly. But because usually clip textures are filtered off, if you ungroup the chest and then select the chest and move it, you won't be moving the clip texture. You won't be moving that brush because when it's filtered off, you can't select it. So that's something to be careful of. The benefits of picking a pre-made chest are that everything's already set up for you. And in fact, most of the chests already come with a key that is set to be used on that chest if you decide you want to lock it. If you noticed it, the chest has the used by field filled out and the name of the key is filled in there. So if you set the chest to locked, that key will automatically open it. If you don't want a key to open it, just delete the key. Sometimes it's hard to get to objects that are down deep in a chest, and so you'll notice that a lot of chests have some kind of cloth texture or straw texture higher up so that the objects are closer to the top of the chest. You may want to consider that. There's also some chests that come with loot already in them, and that's an even greater time saver. You can select a prefab that comes with either low or high loot, and again, just delete stuff you don't want, or switch it around. But if you don't mind the loot that comes with it, then you're already set and ready to go. So the next important entity we're going to talk about is readables. Readables are the primary way for mappers to include important information that the player needs to know. Readables are found under the Readable folder, and you'll see there are two different kinds there. There's mobile and immobile. Mobile readables are ones that the player can pick up and they go into inventory. The player can carry around and read them at will. Immobile ones stay in place. The player cannot carry them with them. The mapper has to make a choice about which is more appropriate for their map. My personal preference is that readables should be movable unless there's a good reason why that doesn't make sense. So once you've decided what entity you want to use and you've placed it in your map, the next thing to do is to go to the Entity menu in Dark Radiant and go down to the Readable Editor. This will open up a window where you will see a version of your readable on the right, and you have some fields to fill in on the left. One of those is the inventory name, and that's what the player will see displayed under their inventory icon, and usually you want to put something descriptive here. The next field is called the X-Data name, and this just has to be some kind of unique name that you're not using for any other readable. It doesn't really matter what it is. You don't have to keep the folder structure there like I did. You just have to make sure that whatever's in that field, you don't use it more than once in your mission. The next step is to jump down to the two fields at the bottom. There's title, and title is a slightly larger font by default that goes at the top of the page. There's no obligation to use a title. You can, if you wish, jump right to body and start typing there. The body font will by default be smaller than the title. You will have to leave an extra space though if you don't want it to overlap. Likewise, you could, if you want, do all of your text as a title if you want it to be larger. So as you type, you will see on the right hand side what it will look like in game. If you decide you don't want to use the default font, you have a lot of options, and this is where the GUI definition field comes into play. If you click the little button there, you will see a list of options for one-sided readables and two-sided. One-sided is for papers and scrolls, two-sided is for books. So we want one-sided for this. And then if you expand the options, you'll see scrolls and sheets, as well as a few other things. And basically, if you click on any of these options, you will see a preview of what the font looks like on your page. If you have more text than will fit on a page, that's where the number of pages option comes in. You can just bump that up to however many pages you need, and then go to the current page arrows to move from one page to the next. Make sure you don't change the one-sided or two-sided options unless you know what you're doing. That should be set automatically by the kind of readable that you choose. And that's all there is to it. You can jump in game and test out your readable. An immobile readable is just as easy. You select the entity from the list and select Readable Editor from the Entity menu. Create a unique name. I've added an inventory name here, but immobile readables probably don't need one. So you notice here you've got fields for left and right. That's for the left hand and right hand page. Both pages can have titles if you wish, but again, you choose whether you want to use that or not. One thing to be careful of is that text does not automatically flow from one page to the next. If you paste more text into the left-hand field, it'll just get cut off at the bottom. It won't automatically flow to the right. You have to manually keep track of that. And in-game it looks like this. Now you can make readables out of regular models. If you turn a regular model into a readable entity, it won't display your custom text until the player picks it up. But it's still something that can be very useful, especially in the case of making newspapers. So if you right-click on your screen and go to Add Model, and then go to the Readables folder and select the newspaper model that's there and place that in your map. The model will start out with a class name of funcstatic, so you need to click on that, go down to Choose Entity Class, and go back to the Readables folder. Here you can choose either Readable Immobile or Readable Mobile, depending on which one you wish. Once you select one of those, then you have turned that model into a readable. Now you can open up the Readable editor. And for newspapers, you need to go to the GUI definitions window or option, click on that button, and you want to use two-sided readables. That's where newspapers are, and it's under Sheets. So if you go to Sheets, you'll see 3 different options for newspapers, and you can pick any of those. For all the newspapers, there are 2 columns. The left field will be the story that goes in the left-hand column, and the right field, obviously, the story that goes in the right column. And that's really all you need to know to get readables into your mission. You might notice that you'll have a new folder in your mission folder now called Xdata. That's something that the Readable editor creates. You don't ever have to worry about dealing with that manually. Just stick with the Readable editor for any adjustments you want to make. And finally, we're going to be talking about levers and switches. Now you can create an entire mission and not have any levers in your map, but they can be a fun thing to add. The easiest way to add them is once again to go to the prefabs folder and look under mechanical and then switches. There you'll see several ready-made levers that you can add to your map. Let's just pick one of them for now. Levers can affect a number of things, but for a beginner, the 2 most common are probably lights and doors. So here's how you get a lever to actually affect something. First, because the prefab has both a regular model and the lever entity, we have to ungroup it. Then select the actual lever. Hold down Shift and then select the door or light that you want to have triggered, so that both are selected. Then hit Control K, and you should see a line connect those 2 objects with an arrow pointing towards the thing that you want activated. If you look at the entity window, you'll see that there's now a target field on that lever with the name of the light. And you could set your targets manually by just typing that in yourself. Levers can activate more than one thing. You just put numbers after each target field. And it can be just that easy. Select a lever from the prefabs, place it where you want, ungroup it, select the lever itself, then select the thing you want it to affect. It's important it be in that order. Lever first, activated thing second, and then hit Control K, and you're done. It's not always that easy though. When you insert a prefab, the translation or rotation values are already set for a particular direction. But when you rotate the model or rotate the prefab, it can actually throw those values at a whack, and you might find that your lever does not move the way you expect. I'm going to put 2 levers in the doorway here so I can show you what I mean. One we're not going to rotate, and the other one we're going to rotate around so that it fits against the other side of the door frame. Watch what happens in game. You can see that the switch that we didn't rotate works perfectly fine, but the other one does not quite rotate the way that we want. So in order to fix that, we've got to go back into Dark Radiant, and we have to look at the rotation values, or the rotate values, set on that switch. Now, it's rotating on the right axis, but it's not rotating the right direction. So we just need to put a minus sign to make it move down instead of up. If the lever's rotating on completely the wrong axis, then you would have to change the numbers so that maybe the 45 is the first number instead of the last number. It takes some playing around to figure out exactly what the right values are. Now, if you don't want to use prefabs, you can find lever entities under the Entity window, Mover folder, and then a little bit down the list there you'll see some levers and some valves, which basically work like a lever except they spin, and you can just insert those into your map and change the rotate or translate values, whichever one they use. The last kind of switch is a button. The only difference between a button and a lever is that a lever stays up when you move it up. A button returns to its original position. Both of them can rotate or translate, just like you can give a door either a rotate or a translate value. So I'm going to demonstrate buttons by making a very rudimentary secret door. So I'm going to take one of the other rooms in my mansion and I'm going to replace the door model with a regular wall model. So this is our hidden secret door. Now, if you remember our lessons from the previous lesson, number 7, we're going to take this model, which is currently a func static, and change the class name to a door. Now, there's already a sliding door entity set up, so we'll use that one. We have to make sure that the rotate values are set to 0, and they are. And then we need to set the translate values. Now, we want this door to raise up into the ceiling, so we know that's the Z value, which is the last of the 3 numbers, and I'm pretty sure the positive values go up. Then we're going to make our button out of just a simple brush. So we'll make a brush and move it over to beside the door, and just for the heck of it, let's put it against the wall and make it look like it is part of the wall. You could spend a lot of time getting this to fit exactly, but I don't think I'm going to bother. The next step then is to, with the brush selected, right-click and go to Create Entity. Then scroll to the Movers folder and down to Mover Button and select that. This immediately turns the brush into a button. Now you can see that it already has translate values set there. I always have a hard time with the X and Y figuring out which one is correct. It looks to me on the map like it should be the Y value, which is the second number, so I just left that as it is, although when we go in and test it you can see it actually goes to the side. I've never found a way to do this other than trial and error. Next thing is to connect the button and the door, so select the button first, hold Shift to select the door, and then Control K to link them. Alright, and checking it out in game, I see one thing I forgot to do. If this is supposed to be a secret door, we don't want it to light up when the player looks at it, and we certainly don't want them to be able to open it just by frobbing it. So, zipping back to Dark Radiant for just a second, you would solve that by going to the Inherited Properties, looking down the list for Frobbable, and set that to 0. Now the player can't frob it, and the only way it can be opened is with the button. Okay, back to the map. You can see that the button is working. It does open the door properly. The translate value isn't correct though, because the button's moving to the side rather than pushing into the wall. So I'd probably have to take that 0.5 value and move it to the first of the 3 numbers. Somebody who's a little more spatially aware than I am might be able to figure that out, but for me it's always trial and error. You can use the same technique on something other than a brush. You could take any model and turn it into a button or a lever using this method, so you can imagine secret doors that open by pushing in a book, or rotating a torch sconce, or anything that you can imagine. Well, we've covered a lot of entities today. It's not an exhaustive list of the things that you can add to your map, but these are the ones that I think beginning mappers are most likely to use. So try these out, and until next time, I wish you happy mapping.